You didn't choose to exist. Nobody asked you. One day, two people did something, probably without fully understanding what it would lead to. And here you are, reading this. And here's the wild part, for a significant stretch of human prehistory, nobody made that connection either. The link between sex and babies was not obvious. It was not instinct. It was a discovery. And it may be one of the most consequential realizations in the entire history of our species. Think about what you'd have to figure out first. A child is born roughly 9 months after conception. 9 months is a long time. Long enough that cause and effect become almost impossible to link without a level of abstract thinking that early humans were still developing. You live in a small band of maybe 20 or 30 people. You hunt. You forage. You survive. And every so often, without any particular plan, a woman in your group becomes pregnant. From where you're standing, that looks a lot like the weather. It just happens. This is not a fringe theory. Anthropologists have spent decades studying isolated communities that appear to have held exactly this belief well into the modern era. Bronis A. Malinowski, the Polish-British anthropologist who lived with the Trobriand Islanders of Papua New Guinea in the early 20th century, documented something remarkable. The islanders did not believe sex caused pregnancy. They believed ancestral spirits entered a woman while she slept or bathed. Men and women had sex freely and frequently, but children were understood as gifts from the spiritual world, not biological consequences of behavior. Malinowski wasn't describing ancient cave dwellers. He was describing people alive in 1915. Now here's what's fascinating. The Trobriand Islanders weren't unintelligent. They were skilled navigators, sophisticated traders, deeply complex in their social and ritual lives. They simply hadn't made a connection that required two things to be true simultaneously: an abstract understanding of time and a willingness to link a pleasurable social act to a biological outcome that wouldn't arrive for 3 seasons. That's not ignorance. That's a genuinely hard problem. So when did humans figure it out? The honest answer is we don't know exactly. But we have clues. The earliest symbolic and agricultural revolutions, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, seem to coincide with a shift in how humans understood animals and reproduction. When you start herding goats and cattle, you start observing them closely. You watch a ram mount a ewe. You watch the ewe grow heavy. You watch a lamb appear. You do this hundreds of times. The pattern becomes impossible to miss. Pastoralism, in other words, may have taught humans the facts of life. There's something almost poetic about that. The moment humans stopped simply hunting animals and started managing them, started owning them, breeding them, selecting for certain traits, they accidentally enrolled themselves in a biology course. The barn may have been humanity's first classroom for understanding where life actually comes from. But here's where it gets interesting. Even once the connection between sex and reproduction was understood biologically, the social and spiritual interpretation of it took much longer to catch up. Many early agricultural societies developed what scholars call paternity uncertainty. The simple, uncomfortable fact that in a world before genetic testing, you could never be entirely sure who a child's father was. This uncertainty quietly restructured human civilization. It drove the development of marriage as an institution. It drove inheritance law. It drove concepts of female chastity that would go on to shape religion, politics, and culture for thousands of years. A biological discovery became a social earthquake. Let's talk about what this meant for power. Once a man understood that sex could produce a child, his child, carrying his blood, able to inherit his land and his name, reproduction became property, and property became something worth controlling. Historians like Gerda Lerner, in her landmark 1986 work, The Creation of Patriarchy, argued that the systematic subordination of women was not some ancient, inevitable feature of human nature. It was a historical development, tied directly to agricultural societies grasping the logic of paternity and deciding to enforce it. Before that understanding existed, there's evidence across dozens of prehistoric cultures of goddess-centered worship, matrilineal descent, and far more fluid social roles. After it, the record shifts decisively. Here's the part nobody talks about. The discovery of sex, or rather, the discovery of what sex does, didn't just change how humans organized families. It changed how they thought about death. If you can pass something of yourself forward into a child, then you don't entirely disappear when you die. Your blood continues. Your name continues. Something of you survives. Scholars of comparative religion, including Joseph Campbell, have noted that the emergence of father gods and lineage-based mythology across cultures seems to track almost exactly with the spread of pastoral and agricultural understanding of biological paternity. The theology of legacy, of sons, of bloodlines, of divine inheritance, may have its root in a goat farmer watching a ram and finally understanding what he was seeing. So, what about love? Where does that fit into all of this? It's tempting to assume that ancient humans who didn't understand the reproductive consequences of sex must have experienced it purely as a physical act, stripped of meaning. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Cave paintings, burial sites, jewelry, and early poetry all point to deep emotional bonding between humans long before anyone understood conception. The Code of Hammurabi, written around 1754 BC in ancient Babylon, contains laws about marriage, fidelity, and the emotional betrayal of a spouse. Sappho was writing about longing and heartbreak 600 years before the birth of Christ. Whatever sex was before it was understood biologically, it was already emotionally loaded. The body knew something the mind hadn't named yet. And maybe that's the most honest way to frame all of this. Human beings are, at their core, creatures who act first and understand later. Felt attraction before we understood genetics. We formed families before we understood paternity. We buried our dead with flowers before we had a word for grief. The discovery of sex, as a cause, not just an experience, was just one chapter in that longer story of catching up to our own nature. We've always been doing things whose full implications we couldn't see. There's a reason this matters beyond the historical curiosity of it. Every generation assumes that the way it understands the world is the way the world actually is. Look back at people who didn't know what sex produced and we call them naive. But we are also, in this moment, living inside a set of assumptions about life, reproduction, family, and identity that future generations will look back on and find equally incomplete. The Trobriand Islanders weren't wrong to find meaning in what they experienced. They were just working with the information available to them. We all are. The ancient human who first made the connection, who watched the animals, who counted the months, who finally put it together and turned to someone and said, in whatever language existed for it, I think I know how this works. That person didn't just discover biology. They discovered legacy. They discovered mortality. They discovered power. They lit a fuse that ran through 10,000 years of civilization, through every marriage contract and inheritance law and religious text and act of jealousy and act of love. All from noticing something that, in hindsight, seems obvious. It always does.